Angela, the less known and less mischievous, but no less powerful sibling of the thunder god Thor. Angela first made her comics debut in Spawn issue... Hold on just a second, guys. I think there's been a little mix-up here. Hey, you gave me the wrong data file. This is for Angela, the Spawn character. That is a totally different company. I need Angela, the Marvel character. What the hell do you mean those are the same person? Okay, so Angela's history is weird. Most of this video is going to be about Marvel Comics, but we are not actually going to start there. We're not even beginning with like another properties comic that Marvel licensed and published. We're going to start at an entirely different publisher, that being Image Comics back in the 1990s. So, let's get going, I guess. Seems like we have a lot to do today. As I partially said just a minute ago, Angela made her comics debut in Spawn issue 9. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have at least a passing familiarity with Spawn, but for anyone who doesn't, it is one of the most successful indie comics of all time. Spawn issue 1 released in 1992, and just kinda hasn't stopped. At the time of this recording, the most recent Spawn comic was last month, and that was issue 367. The creator and writer of Spawn is a man named Todd McFarlane, but we're actually not going to be too concerned with his work for most of this video. See, back in the early days of the series, Todd brought on a couple other writers to guest write a few issues, and this is where our story begins. Spawn issue 9 was written by Neil Gaiman. Okay, well, here's the obligatory acknowledgement that everything we're going to be talking about here happened before it was revealed that Neil Gaiman was a horrible person. If you don't know about that whole thing, let me just say it is not exactly kid-friendly, and leave it at that. I'm not going to be addressing it further because I am going to try and keep this video at least relatively kid-friendly. Issue 9 begins with a flashback to medieval times, featuring a character that looks like Spawn, but isn't. That's going to be very important in a couple of minutes, so remember that this is technically not Spawn. See, the demonic parasite that provides Spawn with his abilities isn't unique. There are other versions of it out there, and this guy was just someone who had one of those parasites centuries before in the past. So basically, he was just the medieval version of Spawn, and since the man under the demon is unnamed, people just call him Medieval Spawn. Simple enough. Much like modern Spawn, medieval Spawn seems to be an anti-hero of some kind, but we're not going to see a lot of characterization for him, mostly because he's about to die, and he meets his end at the hands of Angela. So then, who is Angela? Well, as the name makes very obvious, she is an angel. Specifically, she's a demon hunter, and because the Hellspawn are demons, she is hunting them. Doesn't really matter if they're heroic or anti-heroic or whatever, they're demons, and so they have to die. Not a lot of background or character development for Angela either, and yeah, there just kind of wasn't that in this whole issue. I'll just put it really bluntly for you, Spawn issue 9 is kinda boring, actually. It begins with a flashback where Angela kills medieval Spawn, and then time skips to the present, where she's been given a hunting permit to hunt normal Spawn. She then fights him, and loses and runs away, and that is the entirety of the comic. Despite the simplicity of her original appearance, Angela was popular enough to come back, I'm sure in part due to the fact that her design was very 90s. Actually, I'm looking at all these comics as I'm recording right now, and man, I'm gonna have to choose my reference images so carefully to not get this video demonetized. Her costume in the 90s was egregious. Anyway, Angela's next appearance would actually be in a self-titled comic, a 3-issue miniseries which gave us a little more info on her background. We already knew that she was an angel, and a hunter angel specifically, but this comic adds that she is from the plane of Elysium, which is kind of like heaven adjacent. However, she's not exactly on good terms with them at the time. The plot of the series revolves around Angela being accused of treason against angel kind because she went after Spawn without a hunting permit. Of course, she did actually have a permit. This accusation was just one of her enemies trying to frame her, so Spawn gets called in as a witness to the trial, and then they have a big cool team up. Now, adding to the list of very important things to remember, this miniseries was also written by Neil Gaiman, and it would be the last time that he wrote Angela for Image Comics. However, it would not nearly be her last appearance there. Angela remained popular enough with readers that she stuck around as a recurring character, appearing every so often in Spawn comics and various Image crossovers. We're not going to go over all of these because, again, this video is mostly about her more relevant Marvel history, but the last important note we need to talk about from this era is her death. Angela was a main character in the year 2000, specifically in a Spawn arc leading up to the milestone issue of Spawn 100. One of the big dramatic status quo shifts in this issue to mark that milestone was the death of Angela. Notably, and somewhat rarely for comics, this death actually stuck, and outside of a few very brief visions and flashbacks, Angela would not appear in any Image books going forward from here. At this point, we actually need to move away from the comics for a minute and into the real world. No more talking about 90s anti-heroes punching each other, that's kinda lame. Now we're gonna talk about a far more interesting topic, intellectual property law. Yay! Jokes aside though, this actually is pretty interesting because there's some drama involved. See, years prior, when Todd McFarlane had brought on guest writers for Spawn, he had done something very, very odd, that being enter an agreement with each of these men saying that they owned the rights to anything they created for the series. Or at least, that's the status quo of the deal as it currently stands. The exact specifics are what we're going to be talking about for the next several minutes. Now, don't get me wrong, I am all for creators owning the rights to their work. I think that's an ideal situation. However, I will admit that it is definitely strange to use this type of agreement for a guest writer on a single issue of a larger series. And as time progressed, Todd decided maybe he shouldn't have done that. In another universe, this could have been worked out cleanly. McFarlane maybe could have struck a new deal with Gaiman, bought the rights to Angela, modified their earlier agreement in some way. But here's the thing. I've done something very intentionally 3 times over the last minute or so. I've been saying that McFarlane and Gaiman had an agreement. I have never once said contract. Yeah, so it turns out that the original specifics of Neil Gaiman writing that one issue of Spawn years prior were not done under any sort of written contract whatsoever. It was simply an oral agreement and handshake sort of thing, meaning that abracadabra, their legal debate just got 10 times more complex. Things boiled behind the scenes for a while as McFarlane simply acted like he had rights to Angela like he would any other character. He published her whenever he wanted, and also didn't pay Gaiman for any reuse of his work, including not just the character, but reprints of the Angela miniseries which Gaiman wrote entirely by himself. The conflict reached a public escalation in 2002, when Neil Gaiman officially filed lawsuit against Todd McFarlane and Image Comics for breach of contract. And since the contract was not written down anywhere, this was an incredibly complex lawsuit to go over. For the sake of not making the next 15 minutes of this video me reciting boring legal proceedings to you, I'm going to just summarize what happened, but I will put some court documents and other records on the screen for anyone who wants to really dig into the specifics of all this. The main sticking point in the suit was, of course, the exact specifics of the original oral contract, which turned out to be even worse than anyone was expecting it to be. Apparently, the most detailed key point of this handshake agreement was McFarlane telling Gaiman that he would, quote, treat him better than the big boys. The big boys in this case referring to Marvel and DC. The lawyers had a field day trying to figure out exactly what this meant in legal speak, and to determine exactly what they landed on, I need to explain a quick term in the comic book industry, and I suppose other media as well. The vast majority of work done for companies like Marvel and DC is legally considered work for hire. What work for hire means is that the company retains rights to the work in question, not the creator who actually makes it. This is entirely reasonable for how these larger comic book companies operate, right? Because of course, if somebody comes in and writes a cool new villain for Spider-Man, the company wants the option to bring that character back in future things. The rights do not stay with the writer. Notably though, this is not how Image Comics operates. The reason that Image is still considered an indie publisher despite how big they've gotten over the decades is that they don't hold any intellectual property themselves. When a creator publishes something through Image, they retain the rights to everything that they have produced. This was true for Todd himself as well. He retained the rights to most Spawn stuff, he just also happened to be one of the guys that founded Image, so he was ingrained in that company. McFarlane's lawyers tried to argue that since the original very stupid oral agreement said Todd would treat Neil, quote, better than the big boys, that meant the terms of their work would be similar to how the big boys operated, though better in some way, I guess. The court, however, decided that argument was dumb, with the reasoning being that at Marvel and DC, work for hire is not something that's implied. When someone goes to do creative work at those companies, they sign a contract explicitly confirming that what they are doing is work for hire, and Gaiman did not do that. It also didn't help McFarlane's case that he and Image Comics had been republishing Angela stories without proper attribution or any discussion of further payment to Gaiman. I can't say for sure whether that was like a deciding factor in the decision, but it definitely didn't make him look good, you know? There's also a whole other dimension to this involving an actual written contract between the two parties in 1997. I can't find nearly as much information about this, and I think that this was somehow dropped or didn't go through all the way, but there was some discussion in 1997 about a rights swap between Gaiman and McFarlane, which would have involved Angela and the other characters created. But like I said, I can't find as much information about this. It didn't seem too impactful to the actual 2002 lawsuit. Point is, all of this was complicated and stupid. Again, what I'm giving you here is a speedrun summary of a complex legal trial. The important thing at the end of the day is that the court ruled in favor of Neil Gaiman. Thus, Gaiman retained 50% of the rights to the characters that he created for Spawn. Why 50%, you might ask? Well, Todd McFarlane was the artist on that original issue that Angela appeared in, and thus helped with her visual design. So the court ruled that he was partially her creator as well, and it ended up with him and Gaiman each splitting her 50-50. And while this is less important to this video, it's definitely funny enough to mention that the lawsuit also resulted in Gaiman getting rights to other characters that debuted in that same issue, including a villain named Cogliostro and, hilariously, medieval Spawn. Specificity is, of course, king in the law, and technically, this was a different man. A different man that was just an unnamed guy using the same Spawn powers hundreds of years prior, but legally speaking, that's a distinct character, and so he was included in the suit. Though it seems like this has been worked out separately, and Medieval Spawn is getting things at Image Comics again now. The rights to Angela were also worked out years after the lawsuit, and though we don't know exactly how this played out, in 2012, Gaiman and McFarlane settled their differences, and this resulted in Neil Gaiman gaining 100% legal control of Angela as a character. So finally, 20 years after Angela's debut, Neil Gaiman secured the rights to the character that he loved enough to fight for this long. And then he immediately turned around and sold the rights to Marvel. Fortunately for me, as the one who has to summarize this, unlike the last rights transfer, the legal specifics of this one are actually comedically simple. In 2013, Neil Gaiman went back to Marvel after not writing with them for a time, and then Angela just kinda showed up in a random comic, and then later that same year, Marvel was just like, oh yeah, by the way, we bought the rights to Angela. And that's the whole thing. I told you it was simple. Now, just to be incredibly clear for people who are not familiar with the inner workings of the comic book industry, this kind of thing is unheard of. Marvel and DC don't just buy the rights to individual characters like this, so it happening for Angela was wild. Regardless of how wild it was, though, from 2013 on, Marvel owned complete rights to Angela. And on that very abrupt note, the legal part of this video is over, and the rest of this is just going to be about Angela's history within the Marvel Universe. Well, kind of. We do have to establish, like, how they handled her canon within Spawn, but that's not going to take as long as you think. Angela's first appearance in the Marvel Universe was in the concluding issue of Age of Ultron, which, super random, I know, but she wasn't actually, like, plot relevant to this event. Let me explain. Age of Ultron, the comic, bears very little similarity to Age of Ultron, the movie. It is not about the origin of the character, which I guess shouldn't be surprising. This is a 2013 comic, and Ultron has been around since the 60s. The comic Age of Ultron was actually a time travel thing. In this crossover event, Ultron has taken over the world, and so Wolverine goes back in time to try and prevent the robot's original creation. We don't actually need to go into the specifics of this comic. The only important part is that Wolverine jumping around time breaks it. And yes, by it, I do mean time. The conclusion of the event is all of these weird fractures arcing throughout the space-time continuum. And guess who comes out of one of them? That's right, Mephisto! Nah, I'm just kidding, it's Angela. Of course it's Angela. The exact method by which Angela arrived in the Marvel Universe is not explained in this book. In fact, even Angela herself has no idea. She doesn't know where she is or how she got there, and all we really see her do is vow that she's going to find whoever brought her to this world against her will and end them. This was obviously just like a final page teaser for something happening in the future, but before we get to that comic, I do need to bring up a question really quickly that I'm sure a lot of you have, and probably have had for the majority of this video. Isn't Angela Asgardian? If she's from the Spawn universe, how is that? Don't worry, we're going to get there, just bear with me. Anyway, Angela's first plot-relevant appearance is in issue 5 of Guardians of the Galaxy from 2013. In this comic, the Guardians get a weird ping about a space-time anomaly floating near Earth, and arrive to find a woman that they've never seen before and cannot find information on in any of their databanks. Much of the next few comics is just the Guardians fighting her, but they eventually capture Angela and bring her in, at which point she reveals her backstory, which is, let's call it, intentionally open to interpretation. Angela identifies herself as both an angel and a hunter, lining up with her characterization and history in Spawn, but lining up is the key word here. Angela's backstory here is very quick, and it never mentions Spawn or any official concepts from Spawn directly, which is not surprising given the legality of it. However, reading this comic and looking at the visuals within it, it's extremely clear that Marvel as a company is just kind of like raising their eyebrows at you the whole time, trying to be like, she's from Spawn, remember? From Spawn. We can't say Spawn, but you know that it's the Spawn world, right? If you need more evidence for this being Marvel's clear goal, the Watcher was also part of these comics, and he reminds everybody around, including the reader, I guess, that Angela, quote, shouldn't be here about 1 billion times. Another weird thing that I should mention here is that Neil Gaiman did not write this series, which debuted his character into Marvel. It was written by Brian Michael Bendis, though Gaiman is credited as a consultant, whatever that means. But yeah, Gaiman didn't write it, and he also hasn't written Angela in Marvel at all. Nothing else that we're going to be talking about in this video is written by Gaiman, which I mean is a good thing, I guess, given everything, but regardless, it is very funny that he just dropped the character entirely. This was Angela's status quo for almost exactly a year. She joined the Guardians of the Galaxy and was a regular member of their comic and some crossovers, but her backstory was never developed beyond she's an angel, wink wink, of heaven, wink wink, and she came to the Marvel Universe because of time nonsense after getting pulled there from somewhere, wink wink. After a year of this, more things would begin coming to light that would change her backstory substantially, though I should put a disclaimer before this part, I don't know how much of the backstory I'm about to say was planned from the beginning. Again, there was a year between her debut and her expanded backstory, but also comics are often written well in advance, especially for big things like Angela's debut, so this was probably the plan all along, but also maybe it wasn't, I have no idea. Whether that plan was long established or not, though, doesn't really matter. The real question is simply, what was the plan for Angela going forward? And this is where Asgard finally enters the picture. To start this, we need to zoom out to larger Asgard lore within the Marvel Universe, and actually not even stopping at Asgard, we need to go over the 9 realms as a whole. Of course, the 9 realms, just as a reminder, are Asgard, Vanaheim, Jotunheim, Alfheim, Nidavellir, Midgard, Svartalfheim, Muspelheim, Niflheim, and Heaven. Hang on a second, I feel like there was an extra one in there. Surprise, everybody! There is a 10th hidden realm on the world tree, and I guess there always has been. Aren't retcons great? This information comes to light in an event called Original Sin, which revolves around the death of the Watcher. As a consequence of this, a bunch of people get weird visions of hidden secrets, and Thor gets one of Heaven. Confused and outraged by this, especially because his vision of Heaven included a secret sister, Thor barges home and demands that his mother tell him the truth. So Freya backstory dumps on us. Long ago, there was a 10th realm on the world tree. It was known as Heaven, Heven, spelled that way because I have absolutely no idea, and it was the realm of the angels. At some point, the forces of heaven waged war on Asgard, and in the culmination of the war, angelic assassins snuck into the home of Odin and Freya and kidnapped their infant daughter named Aldrif. The Queen of the Angels then attempted to use Aldrif's life as a bargaining chip to end the war, but unsurprisingly, this just pissed Odin off even more, and as negotiations immediately broke down, the Queen plunged a dagger into the child's heart. Overcome with rage and grief, Odin then unleashed the full strength of the Odin Force in a single concentrated burst, destroying most of the angelic army and severing heaven itself from the world tree entirely, isolating it from the rest of the cosmos. After this event, the Queen of Angels, who had survived Odin's attack, simply handed the corpse of the child off to one of her handmaidens for disposal, at which point the handmaiden realized that somehow, probably thanks to Asgardian resilience, the baby had survived. Not wanting to kill this miraculously still living child, and recognizing that she was so young she would not remember this chain of events, the handmaiden decided to raise the child instead, not as Aldrif of Asgard, of course, but as Angela of Heaven. With this revelation, Angela now had an official Marvel Universe exclusive backstory, and all canon connections to Spawn and that universe were completely erased. So just to make it extremely clear, the Angela that you now see in Marvel does not have any in-universe connections to her previous existence, meaning that we don't have to worry about Spawn being canon to the Marvel multiverse or anything like that. Her weird transfer is just a legal thing in the real world and has no effect on the comics. At this point, I can pivot a little bit because we now are officially done with all legal rights nonsense, and I can just tell you Angela's story in-universe chronologically, which is probably what most of you clicked on this video for, even though we're now like 20 minutes into it, so I hope the first 20 minutes were interesting enough to keep you listening to this point. After she was adopted, Angela was raised believing that she was one of the angels. She knew about Asgard, of course, but she was taught that they were Heaven's ancient enemies, and certainly didn't know that she was the daughter of their king. The one thing setting Angela apart from the rest of quote-unquote her kind was her lack of wings. This was something she was teased for as a child, but in the long run it didn't really matter because she can still fly, though through unknown means. I should note at this point that this is a difference between the comics and Marvel Rivals designs for Angela. In the game, she has one really big wing, but in the comics, Angela has never had these. She had wings in exactly one miniseries, and they were part of her armor, not her body. So why did Rivals do this? I'm not sure, and genuinely, I think it's probably a Sephiroth reference, because they do call her one-winged angel in some voice lines. There may be new lore for the Rivals version of the character which explains this design choice, but if you're curious as to the comics inspiration behind the one wing part, I have no idea. I don't think there is any. It's probably just Final Fantasy. Returning to the comics, Angela's lack of wings did not hold her back in angelic society, and in fact, she rose through the ranks incredibly quickly, which maybe shouldn't be that much of a surprise. She is the daughter of Odin after all, so she was incredibly powerful. In her adulthood, which was a long time later because, again, Asgardian, Angela was named Leader of the Hunt, marking her as one of the best fighters among all angel kind. See, while Heaven was separated from the rest of the cosmos, the city itself was not completely isolated, and there were monsters on its outskirts that would occasionally need to be dealt with. The next important beat in Angela's history came when one of these monsters attacked the Temple of the Anchorites, Anchorite being a fancy term for male angel. If you've really been looking closely at all of these images, you might notice that all of the angelic warriors are women, but male angels do exist in Marvel's version of Heaven. They're just a lot more rare, about 1 in 100. Right from birth, the Anchorites are protected or imprisoned, depending on who you ask, in special temples where they serve the purpose of preserving an afterlife for angel kind, which sounds like a really weird thing, so let me dip into some cosmology real fast. Marvel's heaven is not an afterlife. Actually, as I say it out loud, I realize that's probably why they spelled it differently. They wanted to make that distinction very, very clear. As one of the 9 or now 10 realms, it is magical, but not in that specific way. In a similar vein, the angels do not go to an afterlife upon their death, at least not naturally. When an angel dies, it's just poof, gone, that's it, end of existence anywhere in reality or beyond, unless they have secured the assistance of an anchorite. Anchorites are not fighters or warriors, but anchorite magic is powerful enough that they can create or somehow steal, though that's never really defined, an afterlife plane for their angelic masters to exist on once their body is destroyed. This makes the anchorites essentially afterlife batteries, and as valuable a resource as that is, the angels of course keep them under lock and key. They're also not treated incredibly well here, as afterlife magic requires constant prayer and devotion to function properly, meaning that the anchorites are basically forced into being the most devout monks possible. On the day that Angela was fighting a monster outside one of these temples, she took a heavy blow and was then saved by one of the anchorites named Sera. Now, this was a very rare thing, as again, the anchorites are not fighters, but as we would learn later, Sera was a rebellious type, frequently studying magic that he was not supposed to, and therefore learning a lot more than most of the others. To thank Sera for saving her life, Angela snuck the anchorite out of the temple and the two became immediate companions. It was then very quickly revealed that Sera was transgender, meaning that the cloistered life of an anchorite was even worse for her. Using some sort of heaven magic, Angela figured out a way to alter Sera's form to one that suited her better, and from there, they were an inseparable pair. And by inseparable, I do mean very, very, very gay. Angela and Sera's relationship is not like a fan thing or implied, it is explicitly canon that these two are lovers. They are a big, strong angel warrior lady and her wizard girlfriend. They're essentially just Dungeons & Dragons characters, and I love them. Okay, well, now that I've said D&D and wizard in the same line, I do have to clarify. I know Sera wouldn't be a wizard mechanically. If anything, she'd probably be like sorcerer, cleric, multi-class. Don't be pedantic at me. Angela and Sera go on a lot of adventures together over the next 1,000 years, but we don't get to see too many of them. We do, however, get to see one really cool flashback scene in which a younger Angela kills a much scarier looking angel who had come to claim Sera and return her to the Anchorite Temple. So yeah, these two are they're the gayest comic book characters I've ever seen. They're so great. Unfortunately, at some point during their adventures, Sera would perish in combat. Pause for people to type doomed Yuri in the comments. Okay, Angela tried everything that she could to bring her back, but remember that when angels die, they don't go to an afterlife unless they have an anchorite powering them, and Sera couldn't power herself, nor did she have the service of another anchorite, so in theory, she had just vanished completely. She will be back shortly because this is comic books and nobody stays dead for very long, especially in magical comics, which Angela definitely is. But at this point, we time skip forward to something we already talked about, that being Angela getting pulled into Midgard as a result of the weird time nonsense after Age of Ultron. As a brief refresher, she joins the Guardians of the Galaxy, then the Watcher gets murdered, revealing a lot of ancient secrets. Thor finds out he has a secret older sister. Yes, older sister, by the way. I don't think I said that originally. Aldrich is Odin's firstborn, and wanting to meet his sister, Thor recruits Loki to help him figure out how to break his way into heaven. The brothers are successful in this and make their way into the 10th realm, where of course they are immediately attacked by a bunch of angels because they never really got over the very old Asgard war. At this point, we also realize that heaven has changed a lot during their time being cut off from everything else, and they have sci-fi tech now? It turns out that some magic can get a little bit screwy when your home realm is cut off from the world tree, but the magical blast of Odin Force that severed them from the tree in the first place was so strong that it put a lasting curse on the realm, which the angels can draw power from. So now they have a bunch of weird machines running on residual Odin magic, which is pretty cool. As all this is happening, Angela senses the pathway to heaven reopening and travels it herself, arriving not to help her siblings, but to join the fight against them, because at this point, she still has no idea who she actually is. Things escalate so much from here that it nearly reignites the entire war between Heaven and Asgard, but when Odin eventually comes face to face with Angela, he's able to recognize his long-lost daughter who he thought had perished, and that is enough to calm things down. It's not enough to make the two sides allies going forward, but a tentative compromise is reached, with Angela as the focal point. Since she was a loyal warrior of Heaven for so long, the angels don't immediately try to murder her, but they do definitely disown her upon learning of her heritage. So Angela is exiled from Heaven, and that's enough of a gesture to keep things from spiraling into all-out war. Angela does not go and join her family in Asgard either, though, because she doesn't really have any positive connection to them. She was taken to Heaven so young that she only knows Asgard as her ancient enemy, and would rather die than join them. So, not wanting to accept one of her origin realms and banned from the other, she just leaves, returning to Midgard and going her own way. With every loose thread of her origin now tied up nicely, Angela returned to the Guardians of the Galaxy, and also, Sera showed up again, which is weird. Aren't angels not supposed to be able to do that? Interestingly, the comic itself didn't want to tell us either for a bit. Sera was very cryptic about her revival, but yeah, something suspicious was going on here, and we'll definitely return to it in a moment. Anyway, don't worry about that now, because the next important thing that happens is Angela kidnaps a baby. This is Lausa, another child of Odin and Freya, and therefore Angela's younger sister. And immediately after Lausa was born, Angela broke her way in Asgard, grabbed the kid, and bailed, leading to Thor and a bunch of other very angry Asgardians chasing her across the realms. Thankfully, she did have a good reason for doing this. It wasn't just bitterness at her family or anything like that. When Sera had mysteriously returned, wink wink, she had told Angela a secret, that being that Lausa's birth was corrupted, I guess is the best word, and the nature of the child was a lot more complex than anyone thought. See, Lausa was conceived in the aftermath of an event called the War of Burning, which from the name and the fact it's an Asgardian thing, you can probably guess had a lot to do with Surtur. And while Surtur was defeated, when Odin and Freya did the thing after the war was done, they did it in a place that was still saturated with Surtur's magic, and because of that, it seeped into the baby. So Lausa was gonna explode in a big ol' fiery demon blast and take everything around her too. Now you might be wondering, why wouldn't Angela just tell Asgard about this? Because weirdly, Asgard actually likes Angela, even though the feeling isn't mutual. The problem with that is that the way to fix Lausa's condition laid in Heaven. Remember, Heaven had been draining magical power from the Odin curse for a very long time before this, so they had the necessary magitech to deal with the Lausa problem. This would actually serve them as well, because now that they were reunited with everything, the Odin curse was weakening, and they could use the Surtur magic to power their machines instead. Angela was, of course, successful in this mission, saving her younger sister and repaying what she saw in her eyes as a debt to Heaven for raising her. So everything is fine and happy. Except remember how Sera came back and that was like really intentionally written to be weird? Yeah, it wasn't Sera, it was Malekith. Now, Malekith's appearance in the greater public eye has been damaged a bit by his not very great appearance in the MCU, but in the comics he is a lot more interesting, and he was impersonating Sera so that he could get Angela's assistance in preventing Lausa from blowing up. Not because he wanted to save everything, of course, but because he was in the middle of a plan to conquer the Ten Realms himself, and if the Ten Realms blew up, he couldn't do that, so he had a vested interest in their survival. But this still leaves one lingering question. Why did Angela believe him? After all, Angela and Sera knew each other incredibly well, and every time Angela called Sera's revival into question, she was able to provide a good enough answer. Once again, this is something that the comic did very intentionally multiple times. They kept it weird, but whenever presented with questions, Sera gave the right responses. Big twist reveal at the end of this miniseries, the reason that Malekith was able to impersonate Sera so flawlessly was that he had talked to her, enough to find out her entire history. And he had done this because the Dark Elf had found Sera imprisoned in Hell, so she wasn't actually dead. Well, she was dead because her soul was in Hell, but she wasn't like gone, vanished into nothingness like we thought she was. In another twist reveal, we learned that the thing about angels just disappearing after their death wasn't entirely true. Granted, it used to be. That was the case for angel kind for a very long time. But after the war between Heaven and Asgard, in an act of revenge for killing her daughter, Freya had placed a curse upon the species, meaning that all of them, regardless of their life, would get tormented in hell after their bodies were destroyed. What happened from here shouldn't be particularly surprising, because most panels that I've shown you of Angela in this video have been one of two things: her being extremely lesbian with Sera, or extremely angrily kicking the ass of anyone who stands in her way. So when Angela found out that her wife was alive in some form, yeah, she was gonna break down the entirety of hell. Angela actually found Sera's soul surprisingly easily, but she found her soul in the underworld, and reviving her was not as easy as just taking her back home. She was bound to hell now, and Sera claims that to get her out, Angela would have to rewrite the entire rules of how this realm worked. To which Angela responded, "Okay, I can do that." Now might be a good time to mention the miniseries that this takes place in is called Angela, Queen of Hell. Cue the rest of the series being Angela completing a bunch of magical trials, culminating in her battling and defeating Hela so that she can claim the throne of Hell, all just to bring her wife back from the dead. This did work, and Sera in modern canon is still happy, healthy, and alive. So essentially, Angela saw that she was being written into a doomed Yuri story and then fought her way out of it. Good for her. Of course, Angela's status as Queen of Hell was not a very long-lasting thing. Hela reclaimed it later because Angela wasn't taking that role for the power, she was taking it for wife. And once she had wife, she didn't care to hold tightly on that throne. That comic was back in 2014, and somewhat surprisingly, at the time of this recording, it is the last self-titled Angela series that we have gotten. But don't worry, she does appear in a lot of other things. Angela is often a Guardians of the Galaxy character, or an Asgard character in general, sometimes a combination of the two. Angela's most iconic appearance since the early 2010s was in a comic called Asgardians of the Galaxy, in which Angela assembles a team of Asgardian and Asgard-adjacent weirdos, and then goes on a bunch of space adventures. This comic was formed as an event tie-in, but lasted for a little bit longer than that, and plot-wise, I mean, it's exactly what you think it is. There are shots where the Asgardians of the Galaxy fight Yondu and the Ravagers, so yeah, it's just Asgard and space combined. Wildly, Sera was actually part of the Ravagers with Yondu during this time. Shortly before this, there was an arc where Angela was briefly kidnapped, and when she returned to Earth, she found that Sera wasn't there and had gone missing a second time. Then it was later revealed that she had joined the Ravagers briefly, and she was using her position here to help out some alien refugees. Yes, this does mean that Sera and Angela are going on separate adventures in current canon right now, but don't worry, they haven't broken up, they're just doing separate things at the moment. They have been referenced as soulmates in comics since then, and also, they're immortals, so they're going to have plenty of time together. They can go on separate adventures for longer stretches without it being catastrophic. Now we're getting close to the end of the video, but before I officially wrap things up, I get to do something that is maybe my favorite thing to use this YouTube channel for, that being yell about one of my favorite underrated comics and then tell all of you to go and read it. One of Angela's most recent appearances was in a series simply called Strike Force, which has one of the wildest team rosters ever, that being Winter Soldier, Spider-Woman, Angela, Wiccan, Spectrum, and Blade. It seemed like a kind of random assortment? Yeah, that was absolutely the point. Strike Force is actively about a bunch of weird, not usually team-compatible misfits getting thrown together and doing superhero things like that. In fact, I've actually talked to the writer, Teenie Howard, at a convention, and she confirmed that the way this team was brought together publication-wise was her kind of just throwing a bunch of characters into a book that she thought would be interesting and Marvel greenlighting it. Strike Force is a delight, and I cannot recommend it enough, especially if you like anti-heroes and or magical characters, because this comic has plenty of both. It's also a pretty quick read, because unfortunately it was canceled after only 9 issues, not because it was doing really bad in sales, but because Strike Force was releasing in late 2019 into early 2020, and so it got cut when Marvel was forced to cancel a bunch of their books because of the COVID pandemic. So there you go. If you wanted a reading recommendation for Angela from me, now you've got one. Much like I say about Gods by Jonathan Hickman on a regular basis, if everybody goes and buys Strike Force now, maybe Marvel will notice, and then I'll get more of it. I mean, we'll get more of it. And with that, our deep dive on Angela comes to a close, and I'm very curious how much of this lines up with what people were expecting. Like I said earlier, I'm doing this video this weekend because of Angela's rise in the public consciousness thanks to Marvel Rivals, and a lot of things are different between those two versions. For one, buff, very buff. My god, the Rivals version is so muscular, and I'm sure some of you are disappointed by the comics being less that, but I assume that this model change is just because she's a tank in Rivals, so they needed to give her a bigger hitbox for mechanic reasons. Even her lore in Rivals does seem pretty different though. Now I'll admit, because I'm getting this ready for launch weekend, I am recording the audio before Angela becomes playable in the game, but I have looked at her voice lines and character interactions we've already seen, and it seems like this version is Queen of Heaven, which is a big departure. She also seems to have much more of a connection to Lausa in the game, and one of her big motivations is hunting down the people who kidnapped her younger sister. Which is an interesting reversal given that she was the one who did that in the comics, but whatever. Speaking of, I should very quickly address Lausa otherwise. Some people have been requesting a dedicated video on her after hearing the name in Rivals lines, but I kinda hit everything in this one. Lausa's not that important in the comics. She's only a major character in 2 arcs, and both of those are just other superheroes trying to protect her. Anyway, Angela's inclusion in Rivals really is a fascinating beat, not just for the character's history or Marvel's history, but in comic book history as a whole. Angela has been in a lot of video games before this, but Marvel Rivals is the most mainstream of them, and who would have thought that a character from Spawn would eventually make her way into this? Angela has come a long way from being a generic, sexy 90s fantasy lady, and good on both her and the writers for that. Though, given that I did play with somebody named Simp for Angela in Marvel Rivals a week ago before the character even released, it seems a lot of you still feel the same way about her, and you know what? More power to you. Is that too stupid to be the conclusion of the video? You know what? No, I think it fits. Thank you all so much for watching. As usual, I do hope you enjoyed. This video was a lot more comics industry history focused, especially at the beginning, which I hope was interesting to listen to. This was not like a backdoor pilot or anything like that. I do plan on focusing on lore as usual in the future, but Angela was such a weird and specific case that I kind of had to structure the video that way this time. Only the usual announcements today. I still have a Patreon, which you can check out if you want. Over there, you can find early and ad-free access to all of my videos, as well as a Patreon exclusive video every month. There's like 2.5 hours and counting of exclusive content over there already. And of course, shout out to Ruben Perez, the artist I work with for these videos. I always enjoy using his art, so go and check out his work if you have a chance. And now, no fancy conclusion. See, I'm a tank main in Rivals, and I play that game quite a bit, but in an act of generosity from me to you, I decided to speedrun this video to get it out Angela's launch weekend, and I haven't actually played the character much yet, so I'm going to go do that. See ya!